right, well, good morning, everybody. It was a hearty good morning. Glad that you guys are here, and I'm glad that I am back as well after a couple weeks gone. And we are going to jump right into a brand new series today called Big Questions. You guys are all over this. First service just looked at me like I was crazy. Big questions. And we are going to be answering some really, really big questions. Now, you may have read through these as we were watching that little video, and you're thinking, I already know the answer to these. These are easy questions. I've got a 4-week vacation planned after today. Don't do it. Don't do it. We need you here every single week because we may just approach some of these questions from a different angle than you were thinking. And for some of you who have already settled all these questions in your mind and in your heart, you may be able to say, you know what? This has really encouraged me and it strengthened my faith. For some of you who have maybe questioned or have some doubts about any of these things, it may just help you to be able to turn the tide and be able to change the way that you think or feel about a situation or a question. And for all of us, it may just strengthen and encourage us and help us to have a depth that we didn't have before or a different way of looking at something that we didn't have before. So please, for the next 5 weeks, make sure that you are here and you are already 1/5 of the way through it. Give yourselves a round of applause, unless you leave right now, which I don't want you to do. So we're going to ask the question today, maybe the biggest question of them all, and this is the question: does God even exist? Does God really exist? Is he there? Is it true? And you're thinking to yourself now, well, that's an easy one. He does. Now, before we get into answering this question, I want to give you guys a little bit of history. About 16 years ago, almost 16 years ago now, there was this event that kind of shocked our entire nation, and it shocked the entire world. And you guys remember what it is. There are some teenagers in the room that weren't even born yet when this happened. But it was 9/11, and if you guys remember, that was kind of a moment where everybody probably remembers where they were, what they were doing, if you were old enough to see it, to remember it. And this crazy thing happened immediately following 9/11. Churches became full. Synagogues became full. Mosques became full. Everybody got this hunger, this thirst for God. People began to ask questions. People began to seek God. And all kinds of religious leaders like me, we thought the revival's about to break out across the whole nation. This is going to be great. But something else happened simultaneously. There was this book that started being written by a guy by the name of, I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget here, by the name of Sam Harris. Sam Harris wrote this book, and it was about this time, about 15 years ago, that there was this new wave of atheism that started stretching across the United States. And when I say atheism, what I mean by atheism is the person who does not believe that God exists at all in any form and doesn't believe in any kind of organized religion in any way. That is what an atheist or atheism is all about. And so this new wave of atheists began writing books or writing letters or going on TV and having shows, and they started trying to convince people of something. And this book that was written by, what did I say his name was? Sam Harris. I've already forgotten again. Sam Harris, it was called The End of Faith. And it was written shortly after 9/11 happened. And basically what he said, it took him a while to get it published. Nobody wanted to touch it. But once it got published, it spent 33 weeks on top of the New York Times bestseller list, which meant he sold lots and lots of books. And what his theory was, or what his point was that the problem wasn't terrorists. The problem wasn't any of those things. The problem that we have in the world was people of faith. The problem was organized religion in general. That was the problem with the world. And if we got rid of all organized religion, if we got rid of all faith, if we got rid of everybody who was seeking God, that the world would be a better place. That was his whole theme. And millions of people read this and they bought into it, and people talked about it on TV, and people talked about it on the internet that was kind of around then. And they talked and they talked and they talked. And then he kind of released a sequel because he wanted to make sure that he wasn't misleading. So he released a sequel to his book. And the sequel went something like this. Okay, actually, it isn't just everybody that is seeking God that's the problem. That's really not it. It's more or less people like you guys who are serious about your faith. People who are serious about their faith and take religion seriously. Those are the people with the problem. Those are the people that have the issues. Those are the people that are ruining our world. And if that were to go away, the world would be a better place. And that was his whole theory. And then there were other people who began writing. And they began writing things like, hey, we have outlived God. Like, God had his day. Like he was around for a long time and people believed in him, but we are so smart now that we don't need God anymore. We have outsmarted God. We know the things that there are to know. We don't need God anymore. So it's kind of mitigated God out of the equation altogether. And people ran with these ideas. People love these ideas. So much so that they ended up creating like this new category of people in the 90s. A new category of people that were called, they didn't want to have any religious affiliation, didn't want to say they believed in God. They were called nuns. They were called nuns. And if you want to do some research about this on the internet, make sure you spell it correctly or you're going to end up with something like this. And this is not what I'm talking about. That is like N-U-N. That's been around for a long time. But N-O-N-E-S. Nuns. Meaning, I have no desire to have any religious affiliation whatsoever. No desire for a relationship with God whatsoever. Not saying that, he doesn't exist, but I want no desire for God. And the crazy thing about this is that atheism didn't actually rise because of all this. This category of the nuns rose because of this. And I told the story a few months ago, but I'll tell it again in case you missed it. I actually had a little experience with this idea of being a nun, not N-U-N, but N-O-N-E. I went to the hospital a few months ago for one overnight stay, and as they were checking me in, they were asking me a bunch of questions, and one of the questions they asked me was, do you want a chaplain to come and visit you? And I was like, no, we don't need to trouble them. It's not a big deal. Just say no. He was like, well, then I have to put none as your religious affiliation. I was like, that's great. Yeah, put none. No problem. So he put none. He goes, okay, next question. What do you do for a living? I was like, that's fantastic. Now I have to explain that I'm a pastor with no religious affiliation. So that was a fun moment for me. But the idea is that there is this whole group of people that consider themselves absolutely nothing. I have no religious ideas. I don't want to pursue God. If there is a God, I'm not saying there's not a God. I'm not ready to go that far yet. I'm not ready to say that God doesn't exist. There are still a lot of questions on that side of things too. But I'm also in no way, shape, or form wanting to be a part of any organized religion. And I really don't want to be a part of knowing God, because people who know and pursue God turn out to be mean, bigoted people. And I don't want to be any part of that. And so this whole group of people rose up. In the 90s, this made up about 7% of our population. What percentage do you think it makes up today? About 23% of our population. That is a statistical anomaly. That does not happen over the course of 2 decades. That is insane. But this group is on the rise. And millennials that are coming up right now, they say about 35% of millennials would classify themselves as a nun. So this number is most likely on the rise of people who say, even if there is a God, I do not care to know him. Not going to say he's out, not there, but I don't care to know him. So we have a really, really big problem on our hands. And here's the thing. You're here today at church, so either you have some interest in God, some interest in organized religion, or someone promised to buy you lunch on the way home today. One of those two things is your reality. And if you're here today because you have some kind of interest in God, if you have some kind of interest in religion, here's the thing. Inside of you, at some point, you may have asked a question. You may have began to doubt a little bit at some point even. And you may have even asked yourself, God, are you there? God, are you really there? Or am I just wasting my time and talking to a wall? God, are you really there? Because when I needed you the most, it felt like you weren't there. God, are you sure you're there? And maybe you haven't come to that place yet where you're ready to say that you're a nun, N-U-N or N-O-N-E. Maybe you haven't come to that place yet. And maybe you haven't come to the place where you say, God, you're definitely not there, but maybe you've began to question and wonder where God is and if he's really there at all. And if you haven't questioned that yet, maybe sometime down the road, something's going to happen in your life that causes you to question, God, are you really there? And when you question, it's not necessarily let's put it this way. Paul, who wrote a lot of the New Testament, had some really interesting things to say about people who were struggling with this type of question. And so if you have your Bibles, let's go ahead and flip over to Romans chapter 1. And what I hope to do today is to answer a couple of different kinds of questions. Number one, how can we know that God exists? Is there any evidence that God actually exists? I mean, is there any evidence that God is real, that he's out there, besides just that somebody thought it up a long time ago? How can we know? One of the writers of the New Testament, who was alive a couple thousand years ago, actually talks about that very subject. And then I also want to talk to you guys about what is probably more likely the case. You see, I deal with a lot of people who have turned away from church, who have turned away and walked away from their faith. And when I ask them over and over again, why do you do this? Why have you turned away? Why have you walked a different direction? A lot of times they will explain to me about a God or their perception of God that makes no sense to me, because it's not the same God that I'm thinking about when it comes to Christianity. And so I want to maybe talk to you guys for a few minutes after we talk about this first thing. We got a complicated day today. You got to really, really be focused. You can't let up for a second. I want to talk to you guys about maybe some of the ways that we view God that cause us to doubt whether God is really there. So, Romans chapter 1, we're going to start with this. When Paul is talking about how can we know if God is really there, it says this: the wrath of God. This is a great way to start. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. So what Paul's saying is, hey, there are a lot of things that get in the way of us being able to see God. But then he says this. He says, since what may be known about God is, help me out with this word. Okay, well, you're going to help me out again, but I want you to do it like you mean it, okay? Since what may be known about God is, that's better, among them, because God has shown it to them. In other words, what may be known about God, there's evidence. You can see it around you. God has made it known to you. And then he says this: for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen. They've been clearly seen. From the beginning, it's clear. You know what? You guys know what clear means? Clear. It's evident. Being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. We have no excuse to not see the evidence that God is all around us. But, believe it or not, some people, verse 25, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. They made a bad trade. And they worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. So in other words, Paul's saying, look, this is clear. There's evidence. There's evidence that God is all around you. Even though you can't physically look and see him, we can see the evidence of him being there. It's like if you were standing on one side of a door and you heard somebody shout something on the other side of the door, you wouldn't automatically assume that that was just a force of nature. You would assume it was a person that was wanting to know something, right? And so what Paul's saying is, even though you can't see what's going on here, we can have evidence. And so he encourages you to look around. Look around at the nature around you. Look around at other people. Look around at the things around you, and you will clearly see the evidence of God. And don't trade that for a lie. So this is what Paul says to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you kind of four things. We're going to do something that we called in first service the jive test. You guys ready for the jive test? Okay, this is patent pending. Don't take it out of this room. Okay, we don't want to give this one up. The jive test. And so what I'm essentially going to do is I'm going to give you a statement, talk about it for a second, and then I'm going to ask you if that really jives with you. All right, if that makes sense in your mind. So if you're thinking, if you're doubting, if you're wondering, is there a God, and you're looking for some evidence, I want to tell you this. Number one, if there is no God, there is no you. Let me explain what I mean by that. There's no God, there's no you. Like there's no soul you. Like there's no mind you. There's no personality you. There's no you. You essentially, according to some scientists, are a walking bag of biology. Right? You just walk around, you've got your cells, you've got your brain, which in synapses making you think a reality is possible, but there's really no you. You're just kind of this walking bowl of chemicals that's already set in place, and it kind of is who you are. And that's just kind of all there is about you. There's a couple problems with this. Like, for example, that means that after this is over, there's absolutely nothing. And there's nothing about you that there's no soul, there's no mind, there's no eternity. Now, just a question. You don't have to answer it out loud, but does that really jive with you? That that's the reality? That all we are is kind of this walking bag of chemicals and biology that kind of exists for a while. We were created somehow. We were made, not created, we were made somehow just to kind of walk around, do our thing. But see, the reality is without God, there's no you. Point number 2, if there's no God, this is where it gets real fun. If there's no God, there's no free will. Let me try to explain this. So essentially, if you are a walking bag of biology, and next time you're in a fight with somebody, don't call them a walking bag of biology, okay? I tried that out. It doesn't go so well. If you're just a walking bag of biology and chemicals, essentially you're already set. Who you are is who you are. And there's nothing you can do about it. You are just going to act out the genome, the DNA that you already have within you. That's just going to be your life. You are who you are. That's the way that it is. I've even heard scientists say, you know what? We condemn people in our culture and around the world who are murderers, who sexually assault people. We condemn people who are oppressors. But the reality is they are just acting out what's already within them. And we should not condemn them the way that we condemn them. Now, let me ask you guys a question. Does that jive with you? Does that really make sense? Because the reality is, if there's no God, if there's no creator, if there's no higher plan here, then we're just essentially this walking bag of chemicals, and we're already pre-designed to do what we're going to do, to be who we're going to be. Matter of fact, try this out. When you go to work tomorrow, I want you to show up about an hour late. And I want you to tell your boss, look, this is just what was within me. This is just who I am. I was made this way. I'm just a bag of chemicals and biology anyway, so this is who I am. Then go to your desk. Now, when you try that for a few days and see how it works, right? Because that just doesn't jive with me. It doesn't jive with you. And then it's going to get really, really fun here with point number 3. If there's no God, there is no true worth, only ascribed value. Now, this is really, really tough. You know, I hear a lot of people say, you have your set of values, I have mine. You have your truth, I have my truth. And we'll live separate. You have your faith, I'll have my faith or lack of faith, and we don't need to worry about it. You know what I really rarely hear? You have your justice and what you think is right, and I have my justice and what I think is right. I rarely hear that. And the reality is, if all we are, if there's no God, if there's no higher wisdom, if there's no higher standard, if there's no higher calling, the reality is, who's to say who's right and who's wrong? Where do we even get right and wrong? Right? The reality is your justice and my justice could be very different. And neither one of us would be wrong if there's no higher wisdom, higher calling to call good, good, and evil, evil. Does that jive with you? That that's all there is? And then the next point, which is even more fun, if there is no God, something came from nothing. Now, I'm not great at math. Matter of fact, going up in middle school and high school, math was my least favorite subject. It's still my least favorite thing. When I hear the word, I kind of just tremble a little bit. And one of the top 7 or 8 days of my life was when I graduated college algebra. And I knew that I would never have to do it again. And now my kids bring home math homework. I kind of point at them from a distance and laugh and then go to another room because that's the kind of dad that I am now. And I just stay away from math completely. Not my thing. And even though I am not a mathematician, I know something to be true, something that doesn't jive well with me. The fact that nothing times nobody equals everything we have. I have a hard time with that. Nothing times nobody equals everything that we see. That's a tough sell for me. And that's a tough sell for scientists even. I've even read some stories where scientists said, yeah, we don't have all the answers to this yet, but we're going to get there, don't worry. That's a big leap of faith. That's a much bigger leap of faith than I'm willing to take. The reality is, if there's no God, something came from nothing. Let's even pretend that something came from nothing and there was this big moment and everything's there. Could you imagine how complex we are as people and how complex this world is? And how perfect that had to be? That would be like the equivalent of, You saying like an ink factory blew up, and somewhere in the accidental rubble, you found the entire works of William Shakespeare written out from the ink that had exploded. It doesn't make a lot of sense, right? It doesn't jive with me, and it probably doesn't jive with you very well. I mean, just the exact tilt that the earth has to be on, the exact composition of the earth's matter, the oxygen, the nitrogen, the carbon dioxide. If it was off just a little bit, the earth would become like this flaming fireball. That's a great image, right? But how perfect does everything had to be? If there's no God, something came from nothing. And so Paul says, look, ask some questions. Begin to look around you. And I think what you're going to see is that something didn't come from nothing, that something came from someone, and God is evident. And here's the bigger problem that I see among a lot of people who have left the church or who have denied that God exists or denied that they want to have anything to do with God. The bigger deal, I think, is that a lot of people have the wrong view about who God is and therefore end up rejecting God because they don't know who God is. Another way to put that is this. Many people deny the existence of a God that never existed. Many people deny the existence of a God that never existed. The second commandment, if you go all the way back to Exodus chapter 20, it says this, it says, you shall not make yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. In other words, don't make anything into an image of me that's not me, because that's not okay. And then he says this in the first commandment he said before, it says, you shall have no other gods before me, which is very different. That's don't worship any other gods. Okay, commandment number 2 says, don't make anything into an image that you try to pass off as me that's not me, which is a very different way of looking at it. And you would think I would never do that. But let me tell you a story. In Exodus chapter 32, I think it is, there's this moment where Moses is going up the mountainside, and he's coming down the mountainside, and he's got some tablets, and all the people of Israel are down there waiting and waiting and waiting, and they think Moses has abandoned them, and all of a sudden, they decide, we need God. We can't see him. Our spokesman is gone. We need a God so that when other nations come around us, we can hold him up, and we can say, this is our God. And so they get this great idea to throw all their gold into a fire and make a cow out of it, as if that would be the representation you want of your God. So they make this calf, and then they hold it up, and they say, this is God. But what they were trying to do is they were trying to worship God, but they made an image of God that wasn't God. Does that make sense to everybody? They made an image of God that wasn't God. They tried to pass him off as God, but guess what? He wasn't God, and they began to do crazy, stupid things. And Moses came down. He was angry about this, because it didn't make sense to him. And you would think, well, I would never make a cow and call it God. And you probably wouldn't, most of you. But I have seen so many people make God into something that God is not, was not, and never said he was. And then they look at that image of God and they say, I don't like that God, therefore I'm going to think, or I'm going to reject him, and I'm going to make it in my mind as though he doesn't exist. And then you begin to doubt, you begin to question, and ultimately you dismiss a God that never existed. Now, I'm going to give you 9 examples of these type of gods, or these type of images of God that we make, that you may have made, maybe that you have right now, that God is not, but yet for some reason we treat him as though he is this thing. One of Satan's biggest strategies is that his strategy is to twist our view of God beyond what God has said about himself, and then have us reject that distorted view, thinking that we are rejecting the true God. And I've seen so many people leave their faith, begin to doubt or question God, and maybe even doubt his existence, simply because they had the wrong view of God, and they ended up rejecting who God is. So I'm going to give you 9 examples, and maybe you find yourself somewhere in here. Example number 1 of God is the goosebumps God. Sounds pretty self-explanatory, but what that is that you need to feel God's presence. We're becoming a culture and a nation all about feeling. Everything I have to be able to feel. everything, and if it feels right, I'll go for it. If not, I won't. And it has to be all about feeling. God never meant a relationship with him to be about feeling and about making sure that you feel like God is with you. It's supposed to be about faith and being able to know that your faith is on solid ground and being able to know that even when you feel like God isn't there, that he's still there. That's what faith is. But for so many people, they begin to have this goosebumps God where they say, God, I feel your presence. Uh-oh, God, I haven't felt your presence for weeks, months, maybe even years in my life now. That must mean you're not there, and therefore you don't exist. And maybe if you're questioning God and what his role is in your life, it's because you've made him into goosebumps God, which is a God that doesn't even exist. Or another thing that we do is we make him into smooth sailing God. Smooth sailing God. And what smooth sailing God does is, as long as everything is going great in my life, I'm going to believe that God's there. As long as there's smooth sailing, no choppy waters, just smooth sailing. And then, something goes wrong in my life, or something goes wrong in the people around me's life. Bad things begin to happen to good people, and all of a sudden, this smooth sailing God falls apart. He's no longer there. It's no longer useful anymore, and so therefore you begin to doubt that God even existed. Smooth sailing God. And what's so interesting about this is that our whole religion, all of Christianity, is founded upon the very best person with the worst possible thing happening to him. That is what Christianity is all about. And yet for some of us, we think smooth sailing God is what it's all about. And then when smooth sailing God falls apart, we say, God, I don't even know if you're there anymore. And we reject a God that was never real to begin with. Or how about this one? On-demand God. A few years ago, cable TV came out with this on-demand button you may be familiar with, where you can push a button and it gives you like thousands of movie options. Then you spend the next 3 hours looking at all the options and never watch a movie. Right? And you think, this is a great night. I know what they have now, so the next time I can go straight to it. But a lot of times we think of God that way. We think, God, when I ask you for something, I expect you to give it to me. I expect it to be here. I expect it to be now. And when you don't give it to me, guess what? I begin to doubt that you're there. I begin to doubt that you exist altogether. And when Jesus was here, he basically put an end to on-demand God. He said, listen, I want you to pray like this when you talk to God. Pray, our Father in heaven. And when you talk about God, your Father, man, if I gave my 5-year-old everything that he asked me for, we'd be eating ice cream for breakfast every day. I could see a positive to that. Right? We'd be playing with chainsaws in the backyard probably. Maybe living on the beach. Okay, I can see some good to this, but unraveling my point here. But if I gave my 5-year-old everything that he wanted, it would be disastrous. And if God gave you everything you asked for when you demanded it, it would be disastrous in your life as well. And he said, it's not, you pray, Father, and then pray, your kingdom come, your will be done. Not on-demand God. And so if you live your life thinking that on-demand God is where it's at, guess what? You're going to be very frustrated when on-demand God doesn't give you the thing that you demanded. And you're going to begin to say, God, are you even there? I doubt that you're real. And then how about this one? Killjoy God. What do you think this is going to be about? This is a God that exists for your punishment and to make sure that you have no fun in life. To make sure that you have no fun in life. I've told, when I was getting ready to go to college, I started looking at some of the rules of these colleges and the things that they required of their students. And I don't know if you guys realize this, but there are a lot of colleges and a lot of churches and a lot of denominations that give a lot of extra rules that aren't in the Bible. I don't know if you guys have ever noticed that. Like one of the things was you could never be seen anywhere near a person of the opposite sex if their elbows were showing. Right? Don't look at people's ankles, that kind of thing. And they were so worried about dancing. Oh my goodness, dancing is like the worst thing that could possibly happen. They didn't want you to have premarital sex because dancing may break out after that. But that's how serious some of these things were. It was crazy, crazy intense. And so I began to look at this and I think that's a lot of people's view of God. It's like they want to destroy, they think that he wants to destroy all the joy from their life when there couldn't be something further from the truth. And so if this is your view of God and you think he exists to give you rules so that you could never have fun and never have anything good in your life, of course, eventually you're going to look at this and say, I don't want to be associated with that kind of God. But maybe you're rejecting or questioning a God that doesn't even exist. Or how about this one? anti-science God, because God and science can't coexist. They just can't, right? I mean, because the Bible says things about the sun setting, and we know that the sun actually holds still. We're the ones that are setting, so therefore the Bible can't be true, because I believe in science. The reality is both can exist at the same time. Both can exist at the same time. And so if your view of God is that he is against all things progressive and against all things science, you have the wrong view of God. And of course, if you have that view of God, you may say to yourself, God, I just don't know that you exist. I just don't know that you are there. Or how about this one? Gap God. Gap God, who is in constant battle, a rival of Abercrombie God and American Eagle God. Okay, just kidding. He's not that. But gap God is the God who, like, when you don't know how something happened, you fill in the gap with, well, God must have done it. I don't know how I got that parking spot at the mall at Christmas time. It's a God thing, right? I don't know how I made my bills this month. It's a God thing. God must have done it. And the thing is, a couple hundred years ago, when people would say that, they would give people medicine in hopes that it might work, and then it would work, and you would say, God did it. He miraculously healed. That's great. But the problem is now is that we've learned so much and we've come so far as a society that we can explain a lot of the things that people used to explain as God. And when that gap shrinks and you think, well, God didn't do that. That was medicine. Oh, my goodness. What am I supposed to do now? That God must not exist. And you end up rejecting a God that never existed. Or how about this one? Coexist God. No, I'm sorry. Guilt God. Guilt God is next. This is a fun one. This is where God is like a judge. He sits on the throne and he just wants to make sure that you feel guilty about everything that you've ever done. That happens. People tell me that that's their view of God. And then eventually what happens is you take God off of that judge's seat and you put yourself there or your conscience there or something else there. The only problem is that nobody else can forgive the way that God can forgive. And you end up thinking or rejecting a God that doesn't exist. Or how about this one? Coexist God, where everybody's just happy all the time. Nobody's ever, we're just all going to get along. You think what you think, I think what I think. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what I do. God just loves everybody. Love's going to win, and everybody's going to be okay. The problem with that is we never face our sin, and we never take our relationship with God seriously. And so you may be rejecting a view of God that doesn't exist. Or how about impersonal God? Impersonal God meaning that God may be out there, but why would he want to have a relationship with little old me? I can't matter to him. And so you end up rejecting a God that doesn't even exist. And maybe some of you in the room here today, you've began to question, and you've began to wonder, God, are you really there? And maybe the problem is that you've had a false view of who God is all along. Maybe one of these things resonated with you. Maybe you've got combinations where you think God is kind of a couple of different things. And maybe today you need to decide that you're going to get a real view of who God is, and you're going to leave those preconceived notions at the door that are making you question if God even exists. And so I got a challenge for us. This is going to be a tough one. Are you guys up for it? Okay, a few of you are. The rest of you get on board. This is going to be tough. I challenge this week. You've got 7 days to read all of John in the Bible. It's the 4th book of the New Testament. And the reason I challenge you to do that is because one of the reasons that Jesus came was he came to explain or to show who the Father is. He said in John, he said, I am the Father in one. If you've seen the Father, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And so what I want you to do is I want you to leave your preconceived notions about who God is at the door. And I want you to read John. It's 21 chapters. So it's like 3 chapters a day. It'll take you like 8 minutes to 10 minutes a day. Or if you're, I imagine most of you are going to like cram it in over an hour on Saturday night. But however you do it, I want you to take some notes and say, what do I notice about God through Jesus' life in John? He's loving, he's caring, he's forgiving, he confronts sin. What do I know about God, the Father, through Jesus, the Son? And come back with a list. We're not going to share it out loud or anything, but make a list. And maybe what you'll see is that some of your preconceived notions about who God is, they're not even real. And maybe you've been questioning or doubting a God that doesn't even exist. Father, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. God, thank you for your word. God, thank you that it is true and that we have evidence of who you are. We have evidence that you are here, that you are real, that you love, that you care, that you sent Jesus to die on the cross. And God, I pray for every single person here today. God, I pray that you would help us to be able to maybe leave behind some of the preconceived ideas that we have about who God is, about who you are. Maybe if we're questioning or we're doubting, maybe the reality is that we've made you into an image that you aren't really. And so, God, help us to be able to see you for who you are today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.